Senator Warren.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, as we all know, Wall Street's high-risk betting nearly destroyed the economy, but since then we've made real progress with Dodd-Frank's implementation. But despite this progress, the four largest banks are now 30% larger than they were just 5 years ago, and they have continued to engage in dangerous, high-risk practices. So later today, Mr. Chairman, Senators McCain, Cantwell, King, and I will introduce a 21st century Glass-Steagall Act. For half a century after the Great Depression, Glass-Steagall kept this country safe by separating the risky activities of investment banks from the basic checking and service and savings accounts that consumers rely on every day. The banks lobbied for weaker regulations, and eventually the regulators started unraveling Glass-Steagall, and finally in 1999, Congress repealed what was left of it. So now we propose a 21st century Glass-Steagall so that we can return to the basics and try to keep the gamblers out of our banks. Now, based on what the regulators did to Glass-Steagall over the past 30 years, I don't expect anyone on this panel will jump up and endorse the new Glass-Steagall bill. Even so, we're going to keep pushing for it. But I want to spend my time today focusing on another part of this issue, and that is that a few weeks ago, SEC Chair Mary Jo White announced that she's going to require admission of guilt in a wider variety of enforcement actions. Now, you remember that under its old policy, the SEC required an admission of guilt only very rarely, pretty much only when the defendant had already admitted guilt in some other context or had admitted it criminally. Now the SEC has said it will be tougher when large numbers of investors have been harmed intentionally or when the defendant unlawfully obstructs the Commission's investigative process. Now, I think the same principles that apply to the SEC enforcement would also apply to other regulators. So my question is whether or not you've considered moving in the same direction as Chair White on admission of guilt policies. Governor Tarullo, what about the Fed?
Well, Senator Warren, after the February hearing where you raised a similar question, I went back and asked people at the Fed, the people who do the compliance and enforcement generally, to think this through, and we've had conversations subsequent to that. And I guess our at least provisional conclusions are the following. First, it's important to note that with respect to the Justice Department and the SEC, for example, are essentially, not exclusively in the case of the SEC, but they're essentially enforcement agencies. That is, they take rules which have been broken and they bring enforcement actions. They don't have extensive on-site supervisory presences, one. Two, the precedent value of an admission at the SEC, for example, is of substantial consequence potentially for shareholders' derivative suits and other litigation that may be working off the same set of facts. For us, with prudential regulation, we are basically trying to protect the taxpayers. What we're most interested in is making sure that any violations of or unsafe and unsound practices are remedied as quickly as possible. Well, we're not creating taxpayer derivatives.
But let me just ask you the question on that, though, Governor Tarullo. I would have thought you would have described your job as trying to prevent them from breaking the law at all.
Well, sure.
And that when you catch them breaking the law, you want them to stop breaking the law, but you also want to impose an appropriate penalty.
Well, that we do. We do impose penalties.
And that means that you often settle with them rather than taking them to trial.
Well, sure.
And how much you can settle with them for, that is, how much they will really pay as a result of having broken the law, depends in part on how they evaluate your willingness to push them to trial. So the question I'm asking about is really how much leverage you have. And what SEC Chairman White has said is that she's going to step it up. She's going to be tougher, and she thinks that's going to give her better leverage, or at least I think that's the assumption she makes here. And what I'm asking is whether or not the Fed plans to do the same. You know, when I was here back in February and I asked the question about when's the last time you took a large financial institution to trial, the answer was not good. And it confirmed the worst fears of the American public, that the government is quite willing to take ordinary individuals to trial, but when it comes to big banks, they're not so enthusiastic about enforcing the law against them. And so that's the question I'm trying to ask about. I understand it's different when you have supervisory responsibilities, but you have a responsibility to see to it that this law is going to be enforced. Part of that is taking people to trial. That's one of the tools in the toolbox.
Well, it is a tool, but actually we have, I think, a more, in some ways, a more immediate and effective tool, which is the exercise of supervisory requirements and getting people to change what they've done. Now,
forgive me, Governor Tarullo, I appreciate that you have another tool that you sometimes use quietly and out of public sight. The question I'm asking about, though, is whether or not you're going to require something more public. Following SEC Chair White's change in policy, so that she's going to require admissions of guilt, which at least get us to a place where we're doing something out in public, and perhaps leading toward trials on a more regular basis.
Well, I think the third point I was going to make actually was the sort of third conclusion of our discussions internally was that there may be instances in which doing so would be warranted for a variety of reasons. I guess the first 2 points I was making were simply that given the tools and the abilities we have and the effort to maximize the benefits to the public of the resources that we do have, generally speaking, the use of the supervisory mechanisms I think is probably most effective. Now that doesn't go to the question of what the fine should be. And I think that's a legitimate question, whether you're doing it through a supervisory process or whether you're doing it through a quasi-judicial or a judicial.
So does this mean you will be considering reevaluating your policies along the same lines that the SEC has?
Well, no, I think we're just we're in a fundamentally different situation, I think, than the SEC. I think we are in a different situation. Now, I think, you know, if you've seen with the more recent fines that have been substantially larger than historic precedent, I think you do see some effort to ramp up the kind of enforcement mechanism that's being used. But
I'll say on that, Governor Tarullo, since I see that we're over time, and I will be careful here, Mr. Chairman, I will say there's been some real question about the settlements that you've made. We talked about the mortgage foreclosure settlement also at an earlier hearing, and that Congressman Cummings and I have asked for documentation about what the banks did wrong and more details about how it was determined who was going to get what kind of compensation from that. That was 6 months ago. We still haven't had it. I just want to make the point that if you had real confidence in your settlements and that if people could see the details of those settlements, what the banks did wrong and how you determined how much money would go to individual people, then the public could evaluate for itself whether or not you're really out there fighting on their behalf. And so far, you have not been willing to do that.
I think that set of issues is a different set of issues, because when if one is talking about sort of transparency of enforcement actions, no matter what their origins, law enforcement, regulatory, administrative, supervisory, I actually do think that the bank regulators need to think more about when we put out a public notice of the kinds of supervisory actions that have been taken. And I think just as in a somewhat different context, we've moved a long way with the stress tests and the publication of results on the stress tests, I think there's a pretty good case to be made for thinking about putting enforcement actions, the orders that we will use, as you say, internally, out on the public record as well, which I think does serve some of those purposes, but in our context.
Yeah. I detect in that some change, and I appreciate it, and I say, Mr. Curry, I'll get you next time.